In September, Nixon received a letter from Herman Perry asking if he would like to be a candidate for Congress on the Republican ticket in 1946, noting that Democratic candidate Jerry Voorhees was running for another term, but that Republicans were gaining in the swing district. Herman Perry, as the leading banker, was the most influential man in Whittier. Richard discussed the matter with his wife, the couple having $10,000 in savings that he suggested using half of to gamble on the campaign. After agreeing to Pat's terms, that she never be called on to give a political speech, and that their home be one in which she could raise a normal family, Nixon charged ahead to confirm his interest in the seat. Perry informed him that a search committee, the Committee of 100, would find a candidate to defeat Voorhees. Nixon remained interested. The Committee of 100, with Roy Day as its chairman, was created in response to their contempt for FDR and their frustration with both never being able to either beat him and now being stuck with Truman for another 3 years as the latter sought to expand the New Deal. Day created a conservative PAC and searched unsuccessfully for potential candidates for Voorhees' seat before Perry recommended Nixon to the committee. At the meeting in November, 5 candidates spoke before Nixon who gave brief remarks on his beliefs of individual freedom, concluding, "I will be prepared to put on an aggressive and vigorous campaign, and with your help I feel very strongly that the present incumbent can be defeated." When the committee was polled, Nixon received 63 votes, his closest competitor only getting 12 votes, and Day telephoned Nixon to tell him he had been nominated. The Nixon congressional campaign began with the successful request for Nixon to interview Minority Leader Joseph Martin, who promised they would do everything we can to bring about the election of a Republican in your district. Although the Committee of 100 was willing to donate time to his campaign, money was another matter, with Nixon having to rely on savings and gifts from his mother and brother, while Pat typed nearly all the campaign literature. Nixon, seeking to improve his name recognition, delivered a standard speech to the Optimist of Whittier, the Women's Republican Study Club of San Gabriel in Alhambra, and the Rotary of San Gabriel, his speech recounting his crew of ordinary guys from all over America who won the war and that the government needed to get out of the way and let them work. On February 21, 1946, Pat gave birth to their first child, Tricia. Ambrose writes that Tricia's birth was well-timed, giving her father free and extensive publicity. Murray Chotiner joined the Nixon campaign, having previously orchestrated Earl Warren's successful campaign for governor, and at the time was running William Nolan's campaign for U.S. Senator. Chotiner would become an important advisor to Nixon, though at this time had a minimal role due to Nixon wanting to make all the decisions himself. Chotiner was the only heavyweight in California politics, the only one in the Nixon campaign, as most believed Voorhees was unbeatable in the New Deal favoring district. Within weeks of delivering Tricia, Pat was back to working for the Nixon campaign, being fooled by Democrats posing as volunteers who took a pile of handouts and proceeded to tear up and throw away all the literature. Her husband showed strain at the time, at one point ordering his wife out of the room when rehearsing a speech. In spite of this, Pat served as a source of reinforcement for her husband, cheering him up when he was full of self-doubt and criticism by assuring him that his efforts were worthwhile. Nixon opponents planted the story that he entered politics to serve as a tool of big business interests. Ambrose declares that the Nixon campaign was a revolt of small businessmen, with Perry being the only banker involved before the primary. Nixon did speak to old Navy acquaintance Paul Marshall, a staffer of the Republican National Committee, who wrote Nixon to tell him that he had talked with Harry March about him and that he believed the latter could do much for him. Marshall explained that March was interested in the Tidelands oil questions at a time when President Truman was backing national control over offshore oil. Ambrose writes, "Whether this was a brazen attempt at influence peddling or an honest effort by a man of affairs to protect his stockholders' interest depends on one's point of view. What matters for Nixon is the date." Marshall wrote 8 days after Nixon launched his formal campaign. Clearly, March had no input into his decision to run. Further, Nixon replied a month later to report that he had not yet seen March. By April 23rd, when Marshall wrote back to Nixon, no meeting had yet taken place. Evidently, Nixon never did meet March. The 1946 campaign came at a time when Republicans had been the minority party for 16 years, and in the aftermath of FDR's passing the previous year, the Democratic Party had fallen into confusion and left itself open to the control of the CIO and other groups. Feeling the ends justified the means, Republicans across America began charging the New Deal Democrats with either being communists or leading the U.S. to socialism at home and surrender abroad. The Nixon campaign came to center when it charged Voorhees with being a communist sympathizer, a charge that was untrue and that Nixon knew was untrue, but like the similar charges Joe McCarthy made of La Follette, was not dissuaded. The primary saw Nixon outpolled by Voorhees, who had 7,000 more votes than him, though it was soon pointed out by the Los Angeles Times that Voorhees had suffered a 7% loss from his 1944 campaign. Nixon planned to use a combination of the PAC endorsement and Voorhees' congressional record. In mid-September, liberal New Deal group Independent Voters of South Pasadena invited Nixon and Voorhees to a debate, the two accepting. Nixon was able to get Voorhees to agree to let him speak last, and showed up just as Voorhees had concluded his remarks. At the end of his own remarks, Nixon thrust a paper forward at Voorhees, supposed proof of the PAC endorsement, a recommendation from the Southern California NC PAC that Voorhees get an endorsement. Although Voorhees responded that the NC PAC was not the same as the CIO PAC, Nixon noted members who served in both organizations said both groups were the same, and that Voorhees had in fact received the PAC endorsement. Nixon and Voorhees participated in 4 debates, where Nixon continued to bring up the PAC endorsement among audiences that became larger with each debate. Ambrose writes, on the matter of Voorhees' record, as on the question of a PAC endorsement, Nixon put Voorhees on the defensive and kept him there, primarily through vague charges that could only be answered with detailed refutations which, by the time they were prepared, would be out of date because Nixon would by then bring up new ones. Voorhees had not run into someone like Nixon before, the latter always doing his research and never being surprised, while Voorhees was perpetually in shock, disbelief, or surprise by the charges levied at him. Nixon told the American Legion that communists and allies were gaining positions of importance in almost all federal departments and bureau, with the intent of gradually giving the American people a communist form of government. Nixon also proposed abolishing the OPA, citing the OPA price ceiling as forcing prices upward. In one of his last speeches before the election, he called for small businessmen to be protected from the tyrannies of big government, big business, and big labor. Voorhees' supporters would claim that in the final days of the campaign, voters in the district began receiving phone calls. This is a friend of yours, but I can't tell you who I am. Did you know that Jerry Voorhees is a communist? Nixon carried Whittier easily, 5,727 votes to 2,678. Nixon had a large victory, receiving 56% of the vote. He would later write in his memoirs, nothing could equal the excitement and jubilation of winning the first campaign. Pat and I were happier on November 6, 1946, than we were ever to be again in my political career. In January 1947, Nixon entered Congress at a time when Republicans were in control for the only session between 1931 and 1952. The 1946 election having seen Republicans gain 56 seats in the House and 13 in the Senate in what the Chicago Tribune called the greatest victory for the Republic since Appomattox. The Senate was now dominated by some of the most conservative members of the GOP, such as John Bricker of Ohio, William Jenner of Indiana, William Nolan of California, George Malone of Nevada, Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin, Arthur Watkins of Utah, and John Williams of Delaware. The House had Richard Nixon, Carl Mundt of South Dakota, and Charles Kirsten of Wisconsin. The first priority of the Republicans was to amend or destroy the National Labor Relations Act of 1935, which had given unions the right to collective bargaining and other privileges. Nixon sought to make himself at the center of the attack, trying to gain a seat on the Education and Labor Committee. The Nixons moved to Washington after the holidays, the new congressman noting that he was elected to smash the labor bosses and that his principle was to accept no dictation from the CIO PAC. Ambrose writes that Nixon made his hostility toward the CIO such a major feature of his successful campaign that it was almost automatic for Martin to grant his request for a seat on the Education and Labor Committee. Nixon's second committee assignment was to sit on the House Committee on Un-American Activities, which put the congressman at a point position of routine, out subversives, and curbing unions. Nixon's greatest weakness as a congressman was his freshman status, though he converted it into a strength, joining other junior Republicans in the Chowder and Marching Club. This group would meet every Wednesday for a strategy conference and included Kenneth Keating, J. Caleb Boggs, Norris Cotton, and Thurston B. Morton, who would later become members of the U.S. Senate. Gerald Ford joined the club 2 years later in 1949. Nixon had his first meeting with John F. Kennedy during an organizational meeting of the Labor Committee, where the two drew straws as the most junior members of their parties. Nixon met Charles Kirsten, a freshman Republican from Wisconsin who introduced him to Father John Cronin. Cronin had become disturbed by communist attempts to take over the CIO and started collective data on the involvement of communists with the labor movement. In their early meetings, Cronin told Nixon of communist tactics and gave him names to think about in the crash course on the topic. He urged the congressman to go after certain communists in the State Department. Nixon would soon encounter proof that communism was a bigger issue than just infiltration in the CIO. On February 6th, at the inaugural meeting of the HUAC, under the chairmanship of J. Parnell Thomas, Committee Chief Investigator Robert Stripling said, "Mr. Gerhard Eisler, take the stand." Eisler, a communist under investigation by both Stripling and the FBI, was viewed as the central liaison between the Comintern and the Communist Party in the United States. Eisler refused to take the stand as he reasoned that political prisoners have to do nothing. Eisler and Thomas yelled at each other for 15 minutes before Eisler was cited for contempt and taken back to Ellis Island. Nixon used the Eisler contempt citation for his maiden speech in Congress, calling on the House to find Eisler guilty of contempt of Congress. The Truman Doctrine was an all-encompassing policy of containment, promising American support to any anti-communist government regardless of nature. On March 12th, the HUAC announced it would hold hearings on the bill meant to outlaw the Communist Party. This was the HUAC's first attempt at writing a piece of legislation, and the committee's bill wanted to outlaw the Communist Party altogether and give 10-year jail terms to anyone who mails material expressing sympathy or support for communism. March 24th saw the beginning of the HUAC's hearings on the bills to curb or outlaw the American Communist Party. The committee voted 5-3 against recommending the bill, with Nixon being in the majority. At the same time of the hearing, Truman stole the attention of the HUAC by issuing an executive order that made membership or affiliation of any group judged by the Attorney General to be subversive and to be grounds for dismissal from government positions. Nixon was a staunch supporter of Taft-Hartley, which Republicans viewed as necessary to correct the imbalance created by the 1935 Wagner Act. At the hearings, an enthusiastic Nixon attended meetings every day, including on the weekends from the beginning of February to the end of March. Taft-Hartley was passed in a vote of 308 to 107. Following its passage, Nixon wrote an analysis titled "The Truth About the New Labor Law," a skillful essay so well liked by other Republicans that they ordered thousands of reprints to refute organized labor's criticisms. Ambrose writes, already in the summer of his first session, Nixon was assuming a role that would grow and expand in the future, that of liaison between the moderate center of the Republican Party and the right wing. When Speaker Martin put Nixon on the HUAC, he was not necessarily doing the young man a favor, but Nixon managed to make himself into exactly what Martin had hoped he would become, a relative moderate on HUAC, whose credentials as a conservative were unimpeachable. His earnest defense of Taft-Hartley impressed right-wingers as well as liberal Republicans. He was particularly good at explaining realities to the Red Hots, who thought the 1946 election meant the time of the counter-revolution had come and wanted to get on with it. Ahead of his trip to Europe, Nixon received a letter signed by his original supporters from the Committee of 100, who warned him that he would be subjected to both skillful orientation from the State Department and less skillfully prepared European propaganda. Nixon sailed on the Queen Mary, landing in Southampton and visiting bombed-out London, having tea with Prime Minister Clement Attlee and Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin, and inspecting destroyed Berlin. He also met with Communist Party leaders in every country he visited. He had a debate with Italian Communist leader Giuseppe De Vittorio. Nixon set traps for Communist leaders during his debates with them, as evidenced by him getting Di Vittorio to say he wanted labor unions in Italy to be free to strike. Nixon supported the Marshall Plan upon his return to the United States, although a poll showed 75% of his congressional district opposing it. Nixon remarked that after his trip to Europe, I had no choice but to vote my conscience and then try my hardest to convince my constituents. Nixon discussed the Marshall Plan in his newspaper column, and later at a press conference declared that France and Italy would surely go communistic if the United States did not provide sufficient emergency aid. Nixon noted the Marshall Plan's benefits for Americans in his arguments in favor of it, and told a correspondent that there are still too many people who think that the way to solve our international difficulties is to isolate ourselves from the rest of the world and to become completely self-sufficient. In October, the HUAC began investigating communist infiltration in Hollywood. Nixon attending the first session, and then missing subsequent ones that were described as a lot of showbiz, name-calling, shouting, threats, and defiance, and no light cast on any subject, least of all the amount of communist influence in Hollywood. Ambrose notes that no participants, be they witnesses, prosecutors, or accused, did their reputation any good with the exception of actors Robert Montgomery, George Murphy, Ronald Reagan, and Congressman Nixon, the latter questioning Jack Warner of Warner Brothers. Warner delivered his opening statement, extolling his patriotism. Nixon praised him for producing anti-Nazi films. Warner produced a list of 43 anti-Nazi films he had produced, and Nixon entered them into the record. Nixon stated he would like to know whether or not Warner Brothers has made or is making at the present time any pictures pointing out the methods and the evils of totalitarian communism. Warner said they were working on one, and Nixon asked if he feared opposition within the industry of an anti-communist film. Warner denied this, and Nixon lectured him on the importance of producing films that expose communist methods. Nixon left the Hollywood hearings after this foray, though returned to the subject in November. During a special session, President Truman ordered to appropriate funds for European aid. The HUAC used this occasion to present contempt of Congress citations to the Hollywood 10, a group of screenwriters who had refused to answer questions at hearings by using the 15th Amendment. Nixon apologized on behalf of the HUAC for its tendency to indulge in emotionalism and to get off on collateral issues which have nothing to do with the issue at hand. By late December, Nixon had been appointed chairman of a special legislative subcommittee and began working with Carl Mundent on a bill to make up for the HUAC's lack of legislation. The first was that the American Communist Party is the agent of a foreign government. The Communists of the United States owe their first and last loyalty to the Soviet Union. It argued the Communist Party was not a party at all and has no resemblance to a political party. It is a revolutionary conspiracy, Moscow-inspired and Moscow-directed. Nixon said that communists needed to be exposed for what they are to get them and their front organizations out in the open, label them as communists, and let the good sense of our people take care of them. The Mundent-Nixon bill passed the House in a vote of 319 to 58, but the Senate began holding hearings in late May, a time where such a controversial bill would have no chance of passage. The left in American politics, led by the ADA, CIO, the Socialist Party, the Communist Party, and the Progressive Party of Henry Wallace, opposed the bill along with most major newspapers. The cause was most damaged by opposition from liberal Republicans in the Northeast, led by New York Governor Thomas Dewey. Dewey and Harold Stassen, two candidates for the Republican nomination for the presidential election that year, discussed the bill in a radio forum that attracted around 30 million listeners. They confused everything, with Stassen saying that the Communist Party needed to be outlawed and incorrectly stating that the bill would outlaw communists. With such opposition, Nixon never made it out of committee in the Senate, although some provisions were later incorporated into the McCarran Act of 1950. July 1948 saw the birth of the Nixon's second daughter, Julie, Richard taking time off to be with Pat and the baby. He joined the national radio program Town Meeting of the Air a few days later for a debate on Nixon. Ambrose writes, as the session wound down, Nixon could reflect on his political career to date with satisfaction. In just 18 months, he had made himself into a national figure, albeit still a relatively minor one, on the three most publicized issues of the session: labor, communism, and the Marshall Plan. In Congress, he had been as careful and exact with the facts in his statements and positions as he had been reckless and untruthful as a campaigner against Voorhees. In each case, as Nixon assessed the results, the tactics were appropriate and successful. In summer 1948, Americans lived in fear, a fear initiated by the atomic bombs used against Japan. The development of the bomb and German production of ballistic missiles made Americans feel vulnerable. Only the most optimistic believed in post-war cooperation between Washington and Moscow, as attempts by the Council of Foreign Ministers to achieve an agreement over Germany and other European and Asian problems had been unsuccessful. The Democrats and Republicans were split on how to address the panic, the Democrats possessing the advantage of controlling the executive branch and thereby controlling government files and secrets, and Republicans controlling the legislative branch, granting them control of the congressional probes and investigations. Republicans also had the advantage of suspecting that communist spies had managed to infiltrate the Manhattan Project during the war and wanted to prove it by having Elizabeth Bentley testify before the HUAC. Bentley claimed that as a courier for a communist spy ring in the 1930s and 1940s, she knew the names of spies and gave them without providing any evidence to support her claims. Nixon asked only one question: if Bentley had taken her charges to the Justice Department, and when she confirmed she did, he thanked her for coming before the committee. Nixon suggested to striplings that committee investigators question Whittaker Chambers, who he had learned from Father Cronin that Chambers had named many of the same people that Bentley had accused. Chambers confirmed that he knew more than Bentley and was subpoenaed, which led to him testifying before the HUAC on August 3, 1948. Over the next 2 days, the committee called men named by Bentley and Chambers to testify. There was one accused person who insisted on appearing before the HUC. His name was Alger Hiss, the Carnegie Endowment president who was friends with Dean Acheson and members of the Washington social community and the State Department. Hiss denied having membership or being friends with anyone in the Communist Party, following the communist line, or ever having heard the name Whittaker Chambers. Nixon sensed Hiss was bluffing, as Hiss's association with the Communist Party was commonly talked about by those in Washington seeking to oust the Reds. Beginning in 1943, J. Edgar Hoover had tried to warn both Presidents Roosevelt and Truman about Hiss, but no documented evidence ever surfaced, with Hiss being eased out of his policymaking role and then government altogether. Nixon also believed Hiss was bluffing because the latter never directly stated that he did not know Whittaker Chambers. When the HUAC reconvened, angry members berated the staff for not checking on Chambers before putting him on the stand. Eddie Herbert argued that the only way for the committee to get the public off the Hiss case was to turn it over to the Justice Department. Ambrose writes that Nixon was against this because the Justice Department had previously done nothing to Hiss, in spite of previous accusations, and he viewed the Justice Department as his real target. Nixon told colleagues that turning the case over to the Justice Department would be a public confession from the committee of incompetence and recklessness. He said the committee did not have to prove Hiss was a communist and only had to confirm he was lying about not knowing Chambers. These arguments prevailed, Munt agreeing to appoint a subcommittee that would question Chambers further, with Nixon as the subcommittee's head. The HUAC questioned people Chambers had named as communists and made no breakthroughs. Nixon and Stripling had the committee staff searching for anything that could link Hiss to Chambers. Nixon also went to visit Chambers on his farm in Westminster, Maryland at least 3 times. Nixon later writing that the visits were done so he could determine if Chambers, in speaking with Hiss, was speaking of a man he knew or was telling a story he had concocted. Chambers told Nixon that he had come forward to warn his country and asserted that the case was larger than a clash of personalities, warning Nixon, "This is what you must get the country to realize." The elder Nixons had moved to a farm near York, Pennsylvania, their son calling the pair regularly, and found that they were upset with the newspaper uproar about their son and the case. Hannah told her son, "Richard, why don't you drop the case? No one else thinks Hiss is guilty. You are a young congressman. Older congressmen and senators have warned you to stop. Why don't you?" Nixon replied, "Mother, I think Hiss is lying. Until I know the truth, I've got to stick it out." Nixon conducted a series of consultations in Washington, first with counsel for the Senate Investigating Committee, William Rogers, and then with chief Washington correspondent of the New York Herald Tribune, Bert Andrews. Nixon gave Andrews the August 7th testimony to read, and it convinced the latter that Chambers knew Hiss. August 11th saw Nixon call John Foster Dulles, who Ambrose describes as the epicenter of power in the Republican Party, as the chief foreign policy advisor for Thomas Dewey. The two met at the Roosevelt Hotel in New York, and Nixon asked Dulles if he should proceed with the investigation. Dulles answered, "You'd be derelict in your duty as a congressman if you did not see the case through to a conclusion." Nixon asked Burt Andrews to question Chambers, and Andrews asked Chambers if he was a drunk or if he had ever been to an insane asylum, noting that Chambers was a man who would answer all questions but volunteer nothing. Andrews would later question why neither he nor Nixon asked Chambers if he had any documentary evidence. Ambrose writes, "Why not, indeed? This was Nixon's biggest single mistake, not only at this stage but again later in the case, but he was hardly alone." Beginning with Chambers' original confession and accusations to Burrell in 1939, continuing through Chambers' testimony to the FBI in 1943, and again in 1945, on to the HUAC hearings in 1948, literally dozens of people had an opportunity to ask Chambers the simplest yet most crucial questions. Do you have any documentary evidence to support these charges? No one asked the question, why not, to repeat, is a puzzlement. Nixon's subcommittee met in executive session on August 16th, where Nixon bombarded Hiss with questions about his personal life and observed as Hiss began twisting, turning, evading, and changing his story to fit the evidence he knew we had. Nixon pressed Hiss on his maids' names, the makes and years the cars he had owned, and his place of residence before Hiss revealed he had known Chambers but under a different name, George Crossley. Hiss claimed to hardly know Mr. Crossley, but confirmed to have let him stay in his home and lend him an old car. Nixon asked Hiss if he had a hobby, and when the latter said bird watching, the congressman asked him about the warbler he had seen in Arlington. The subcommittee agreed to a public meeting of Chambers and Hiss on August 25th. The evening saw Nixon decide that delaying the public confrontation would be playing into Hiss's hands by giving him time to make his story fit the facts. Nixon called Stripling at 2 a.m. on August 17th, and the latter summoned Chambers and Hiss to testify before the subcommittee that very afternoon. Nixon asked Hiss if he had ever met Chambers before, and Hiss responded by asking to hear Chambers' voice again. Nixon told Hiss that he should ask Chambers some questions. Hiss identified Chambers as George Crossley, and Stripling asked if he could produce 3 people that could identify Chambers as Crossley. Nixon asked Chambers if the man in front of him was Alger Hiss, and Chambers confirmed he was. Hiss dared Chambers to make his allegations public, and Nixon disputed that Hiss had only known Crossley for a short time when he had allowed the man to both live in his house and be given free use of his car. Hiss asked the committee to interview his wife, and Nixon agreed, the latter having proven that Hiss and Chambers knew each other. Ambrose describes Nixon as almost somnolent when interviewing Hiss's wife, Priscilla, the latter later writing that he could have broken her story but lacked sleep. The HUAC arranged a public confrontation between Chambers and Hiss on August 25th, with Nixon spending 18 to 20 hours on the case, directing a search for anyone who had known Chambers as Crossley and evidence that supported Chambers' testimony about his relationship with Hiss. The August 25th session was a bitter one, with Nixon and Hiss sparring about when the latter had known Crossley, the circumstances, and the whereabouts of the car. Hiss repeated his challenge for Chambers to make his communism claims about in public and was on the stand for 5 hours. Chambers took the stand after Hiss was finished and repeated his charges and claimed Hiss was lying. Chambers said, "The story has spread that in testifying against Mr. Hiss, I am working out some old grudge or motives of revenge or hatred. I do not hate Mr. Hiss. We were close friends, but we are caught in the tragedy of history. Mr. Hiss represents the concealed enemy against which we are all fighting, and I am fighting." On August 27th, the HUAC released all transcripts under the title, "Hearings Regarding Communist Espionage in the United States." The first week of September saw the Nixon's vacation in Ocean City, Maryland. When the congressman returned to Washington, he wrote a letter to John Foster Dulles, summarizing the hearings and insisting that Hiss was guilty before urging him to ease Hiss from his position as president of the Carnegie Endowment. Dulles refused, but Hiss was granted leave of absence. Nixon, Andrews, and others pressured both Dulles and Dewey to make the domestic communists, and Hiss in particular, a campaign issue, but they refused. Nixon spent the fall months campaigning for other Republicans, the party being confident about their prospects in 1948. What came next was an unpleasant surprise for Republicans. Truman was reelected and brought with him the return of a Democratic Congress. On December 1st, Nixon read a United Press story reporting that the senior officials at the Justice Department were getting ready to drop its investigation of perjury towards either Hiss or Chambers unless additional information was forthcoming. There was a story in the Washington Post that claims some very startling information on who's a liar is reported to have been uncovered. Hiss's chief lawyer, William Marbury, asked Chambers if he had any documents to support his charges. Chambers produced copies of the documents and said they had been stolen from the State Department via Hiss, who followed this by giving them to a Russian agent. The development made Chambers a confessed perjurer, and Hiss was now accused of treason. Alan Weinstein believed Nixon felt angry at Chambers, who never told him of the documents or spying. Nixon was angered by the Justice Department being in possession of the stolen documents for 2 weeks and doing nothing with them besides leaking the story to the press. Nixon berated Chambers for giving the documents, although the latter claimed he had more evidence, and Nixon told him to not give it to anyone besides the committee. Nixon told Stripling that he did not believe Chambers had a damn thing and insisted on going on vacation. Nixon telephoned Burt Andrews, who instructed him to have Stripling to issue a blank subpoena on Chambers to produce everything still in his possession. The Nixons went on their long-delayed vacation, as Stripling sent 2 HUAC staffers to Westminster with Chambers. The latter obtained rolls of microfilm containing copies of State Department documents that included some in Hiss's handwriting. Stripling wired Nixon, and Nixon radioed Stripling to make arrangements to get him off the boat. A power struggle began between the Justice Department, the FBI, and the HUAC over control of the Pumpkin Papers, and the case in general. Ambrose writing that it was a classic struggle between the executive branch and the Congress over the immediate issue of first claim on evidence, and the far more significant long-term issue over control of security procedures and national policy itself. When Alex Chambers indicated that the Justice Department was contemplating indicting Chambers, Nixon knew this would mean Hiss would get away and his own career would be over, and moved to get the public to react. Nixon and Stripling held a press conference on December 5th, where they showed the press its first glimpse of the microfilm documents. Ahead of the conference, Nixon and Stripling learned that the copies of the film had been made in 1945, which meant that despite Chambers claiming they were made in 1938, it appeared he had manufactured the evidence after the war. This sent Nixon into a panic, and he made an unsuccessful attempt to call off the press conference altogether. Before the conference began, they learned that a mistake had been made, and the film was made in 1937. The press conference was a success, getting headlines and front-page photographs. Shortly thereafter, Nixon resisted efforts by Truman administration officials to turn over the microfilm and call off the investigation. At the hearing, Chambers said his wife had copied some of the documents on her typewriter and that he had returned the originals to a State Department desk, while Chambers would give the copies to a Soviet intelligence agent. The copies by Chambers were meant as a possible blackmail should the Communist Party threaten him. Hoover acted on his own when he ordered a search for Priscilla Hiss's typewriter, which was found by his agents on December 13th. Nixon, after being threatened with a contempt citation, made the Pumpkin Papers available to the FBI. On December 15th, the grand jury voted unanimously to indict Hiss on 2 counts of perjury, both for lying about not stealing the State Department documents and giving them to Chambers and claiming to have not seen Chambers after 1935. Ambrose writes, "So Nixon won the first round. In the process, he learned some unsavory lessons not only about the extent of communist infiltration into the government and about spy rings, but also about what lengths the administration was willing to go to in order to present embarrassment. He was introduced to that intricate game that is Washington politics, in which the only thing that counts is success, and where anything goes. The case was filled with leaks, lies, deceptions, the deliberate use of the Justice Department for partisan political purposes, the manipulation of the press and public opinion, and brazen attempts at cover-up. Nixon also learned about personal crisis management. He analyzed his own actions and reactions carefully, all within the context of his discovery that he thrived on crisis, actually enjoyed it, and did his best when he was under pressure. He also learned to be alert in the post-crisis stage because he tended to let down at that time. What he did not learn, or at least never mention in his extensive writings on his case and the subject of crises, was that there came a point when the tension was unbearable, and at that point he would lash out in an uncontrollable fit of temper. He did it with Stripling at least twice, and he would do it again at some stage in every future crisis of his life. But overall, the Hiss case had been quite an educational experience, and Nixon was a quick learner. It also made him into a world figure with an unlimited future. As 1949 began, the majority of the American public believed Alger Hiss was a communist spy who had committed perjury, espionage, and treason, with it being unlikely that he ever would have been supposedly exposed had it not been for Nixon. Ambrose writing, this fact meant that Nixon now had a national political base that was the envy of every other congressman in the country. Nixon worked for his supporters in the 12th District, managing to get $500,000 for dams for the district at a time when agriculture remained the largest industry. He wanted to capitalize on his role in the Hiss case, eyeing the 1950 California Senate race in which Democratic incumbent Sheridan Downey was up for re-election amid persistent rumors that he did not intend to run again. On June 5, 1949, Nixon held a conference with California Senator and fellow Republican Bill Nolan, knowing the latter's support was critical and asking for an endorsement from the Oakland Tribune. Nolan did not indicate he was any more favorable to Nixon's candidacy, and the latter became convinced that Nolan would support him if he believed he had the best chance to win. This led Nixon to tour the state to gain support from backers in the Committee of 100 and Bewley and Day. His prospective Senate run received support from former President Herbert Hoover and bankers in San Francisco. Ambrose writes that none of Nixon's support would matter if the Hiss case ended with the latter being found not guilty, which would cause Nixon to be seen as witch hunting. The trial, beginning on May 31st, 1949, would continue through June and July. Nixon had a 2-hour call with reporter Victor Lasky, who wrote to Thomas Murphy that Nixon has a heck of a lot at stake in the outcome. Anyway, I got a couple of things which he thought you should like to know based on his many dealings with our boy Alger in the House Committee. 8 jurors voted to convict Hiss, and 4 voted to acquit. Nixon lashed out at the judge, remarking that Kaufman's prejudice for the defense and against the prosecution was so obvious and apparent that the jury's 8-4 vote for a conviction frankly came as a surprise to me. After Nixon demanded that Kaufman be investigated by House inquiry, the former knowing the Democratic-controlled Congress would do no such thing, Truman took the unusual step of publicly defending Kaufman and called him a good judge. I appointed him. He acted all right. Nixon demanded a new judge for the second trial that would take place in fall and a new prosecutor, Ambrose noting that Nixon's fate was in the hands of those unknown and as yet unselected jurors between mid-July to January 1950. Nixon wrote to Pat Hillings, as far as the Senate race is concerned, I think it is just as well to let it roll along at the present time, July 1949, without saying too much about me individually. He furthered that a lot of quiet groundwork can be done, which will mean a great deal to us in the event I decide to run. This quiet groundwork commenced with Nixon hiring Frank Jorgensen, the latter having $10,000 already available to assist with Nixon's political expenses. Declining to serve as campaign manager, Jorgensen suggested Murray Chotiner, who had served in campaigns for both Nolan and Warren. Ambrose writes that Nixon knew Chotiner was tough, immoral, and ruthless, and that the latter would run a slashing anything-to-win campaign. The Hiss case was a big bet, Ambrose writing that Nixon's whole career was on the line, and that if he won the bet, if Hiss was convicted, he would collect his all-time biggest pot, a ticket to the Senate, providing, of course, that he kept up the momentum, even increased the size and scope of his attack. With a Hiss conviction, Nixon could focus his campaign for the Senate seat on a national level, making foreign policy the major issue and centering his attack on Truman and Atchison. Ambrose furthers, fear. Nixon knew that fear was the way to get to the public. Fear of Alger Hiss and his kind, fear of Stalin and his bombs and rockets, fear of change, fear of someone getting ahead in the arms race, fear. He writes that while fear of communism was unsuccessful as a partisan issue in the 1948 campaign. It was rapidly becoming the biggest issue just a year later, and cites intervening events such as the Hiss indictment, the atomic spy ring case, the communist victory in China, with provoking concerns of it. Nixon announced his senatorial campaign on November 3rd, 1949. 2 weeks after Nixon's announcement, the second Hiss trial opened. He had a new lawyer, Claude Cross, and in claiming that Chambers was inside, a new defense. On January 21st, 1950, the forewoman in the second Hiss trial declared, "We find the defendant guilty." After Hiss was convicted, Nixon told the press, "I believe President Truman will have further reason to regret his red herring remark." The ominous comment was followed by Nixon giving an hour-and-a-half speech on the House floor that summarized his role in the Hiss case and called for support of the FBI, extending the statute of limitations on espionage cases from 3 to 10 years, the House supporting the HUAC and an overhaul of the system used to check the loyalty of federal employees. Nixon returned to campaigning, cross-filing to run in the Democratic primary and delivering a handbill to Democrats that did not identify him as a Republican. Senator Downey was being challenged by Congresswoman Helen Gagan Douglas, a former opera and Broadway star first elected to Congress in 1944. In an aggressive campaign, Douglas accused Downey of doing nothing in Congress, being a tool of big business, and being in the pocket of California oilmen. Her gender caused resentment from male politicians, and her policies caused rage among conservatives. Congressman John F. Kennedy came to Nixon's office one afternoon and handed him an envelope with $1,000 in campaign contributions.
In 1950, he came into the outer office. My secretary buzzed and said, "Congressman Kennedy is here." And so, of course, he came right in and he handed me an envelope. He said, I know you got a tough campaign against Helen Gagan Douglas, and the family'd like to contribute." So he handed it to me, and there was $1,000 in cash. Later on, I think it was quite embarrassing to him, and he wanted it made very clear that the contribution was from his father and not for him personally, but he was delivering it. There was no question that whose side he was on. And later on, after the election, when he was speaking at Harvard, he said that he was not unhappy about my defeating Helen Gagan Douglas because he had not found her one that he liked to work with in the Congress of the United States.
Ambrose writes that Nixon painted a fearful picture of insidious, unnamed forces at work, but he had made no direct accusations. Douglas stated that she was a more effective anti-communist than Nixon, but the latter was able to convince most voters to make their decision on a lone question: is communism a threat? Douglas said it was not, and Nixon said it was. Ambrose writing of Nixon, and that was by far the most important factor in his ultimate victory. While Douglas and Buddy went after each other, Nixon concentrated on building his base of support for the general election, reaching voters with 600 speeches during the primary, supporting Chiang Kai-shek and his Nationalist Party, seeking out the labor vote, and securing a financial base. The June 7th primary saw Nixon receive 1 million votes to Douglas's 890,000 and Bodie's 535,000. Within weeks, the communist North Koreans attacked South Korea, boosting the Nixon campaign as the candidate had warned the Truman-Acheson policy of appeasement in Asia led to war. As the general election commenced, the campaign deteriorated into a name-calling contest, the New York Times noting that each side accuses the other of hitting a new low in distortion. The Nixon campaign printed a pink sheet, 50,000 copies at first, with the headline, "Douglas Marcantonio Voting Record." The leaflets had dates, reference data, and analogies noting 354 occasions in which Douglas and Congressman Vito Marcantonio had voted alike. Most of these votes were in keeping with their shared political party. Nixon himself had voted with Douglas and Marcantonio over 100 times, and Ambrose writes, "There was no Douglas-Marcantonio axis, as Nixon well knew, just as he knew that his larger implied charge was untrue." The leaflet being printed on pink paper was also a way to remind voters that his opponent was female. President Truman so badly wanted Nixon beaten that he sent prominent members of the Democratic Party, such as Vice President Alvin Barkley, Labor Secretary Maurice Tobin, Attorney General Howard McGarth, Agriculture Secretary Charles Brannan, and almost the entire Truman cabinet came to California pleading for Douglas to win. The only prominent Republican to visit California at the time, Joseph McCarthy, came there to call for the ouster of Atchison. On October 25th, the Chinese communists intervened in Korea at a time when Nixon was pressing Douglas to state her position on whether China should be admitted to United Nations. Douglas refused to answer, and Nixon said, "I know that my opponent was committed to the State Department policy of appeasement toward communism in the Far East, but I never dreamed she would stick to it even after we were attacked." Ambrose writes that the 1950 campaign had become surrounded in the mythology that Nixon destroyed the reputation of a woman who was as pure as the driven snow. He furthers that Nixon did regard Douglas as a threat to the Republic, as although the communists would never come to power, there was a real chance that the New Deal, as represented by such luminaries as Harry Truman and Helen Douglas, would stay in power, and New Deal policies, Nixon said, meant socialism at home and surrender abroad. Further, it was the New Deal, not the CPUSA, that by holding power prevented the Republicans from holding power. Therefore, it was the New Deal, not the CP, that was the real enemy. Nixon won the election with a margin of 680,000 votes. Downey announced his resignation on November 30th, 2 weeks later, allowing Nixon to gain seniority over incoming freshman senators. Ambrose writes, the momentum that had begun when Nixon first announced that he was running against Voorhees 5 years earlier was still building. Nixon celebrated his 38th birthday on January 9, 1951, now a national figure due to the Hiss case, and a senator who had won his seat by the largest margin of any senator running for an open seat or re-election. Nixon had also become his party's most sought-after speaker and was the most successful Republican fundraiser due to both his reputation and statements. By 1951, he made speeches almost every day, and by the end of the year appeared in 25 states. His most important speech was delivered on June 28, 1951, to the National Young Republican Convention. Nixon chided the Truman administration for not securing international support from Korean allies and charged that communists had infiltrated the very highest councils of this administration. Nixon was later in attendance when NATO's Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower addressed a joint session of Congress in which he called for Congress to not limit the number of troops that could be sent to Europe and that the U.S. rearm Europe. Nixon did not work as hard as a new senator as he had during his freshman year in the House, though he made sure to establish relationships with all the Republican senators as well as the conservative Democrats. The California senator became a subject of conversation in the 1952 presidential election as a possible vice presidential candidate. The contenders for the top spot on the ticket were Eisenhower, Taft, Governor Warren, and Harold Stassen. When Palmer asked Nixon to send some political gossip in February, Nixon replied with a letter in which he stated that Taft was the favorite of the hardcore of the party, but would be difficult to elect. Nixon viewed Eisenhower as the most obvious candidate to stop Taft, and that if the general declared himself a candidate, there would be no question whatever that he would get the nomination. He concluded by saying Republicans should assume the worst, and that the Democrats would dump Truman for a strong candidate who would likely defeat Taft. He asserted that the GOP should get together on our strongest electable man and start building him up now. The candidate Nixon most desired was Eisenhower due to the latter's enormous popularity. The first Nixon-Eisenhower meeting occurred in summer 1950 at a retreat of San Francisco's Bohemian Club. The two met again 9 months later for a private conversation, Nixon being awed by Eisenhower, who mutually thought highly of him due to his role in the Hiss case, remarking, "The thing that most impressed me was that you not only got Hiss, but you got him fairly." The conversation left Nixon convinced that Eisenhower was the most knowledgeable on foreign policy of all the candidates and should be the next president. In May, Nixon was among 45 Republicans invited to a Stassen strategy conference, Stassen having produced a poll that showed he could win if Eisenhower and Taft deadlocked at the convention. Stassen promised he would name Nixon as his running mate in the event the latter could swing a large portion of the California delegation to him. Nixon would not commit. Around this time, Nixon cultivated relationships with Ralph de Todeno, the author of a book on the Hiss case, and Earl Mazzo. Friendships were used to spread his views, Nixon meeting with George Sokolowski and Taft supporting reporters and telling them that Taft could not win while Eisenhower could. In 1948, Truman had issued an executive order that ended the executive department giving security files to congressional committees. Although Truman had hoped to dry up the HUAC from a lack of documents, The order strengthened the position of the anti-communists, with Joe McCarthy charging that Johns Hopkins University professor Owen Lattimore was Russia's top espionage agent in America, but that he could not prove it due to the State Department loyalty files being inaccessible. Nixon joined in, claiming there was a cover-up and a blatant misuse of executive privilege. Though no longer a member of the HUAC and the communist hunting business, Nixon kept tabs on Alger Hiss, issuing an exuberant press release after the Supreme Court rejected Hiss's appeal for a review of his case. By summer 1951, books were beginning to appear, Nixon reading a review of one of them in the Minnesota Law Review by Charles Allen Wright. Nixon, so disturbed by Wright's review, wrote to a businessman friend in Minneapolis and urged him that if you have any influence with the regents at the University of Minnesota, it would be well to bring to their attention the type of fellow Wright is. Nixon wrote a review of Chambers' book, Witness, calling it a great book that showed Americans that men could become communists with the best of intentions. Nixon's way of addressing Joe McCarthy, who had become a problem that bothered all Republican senators, was to never criticize McCarthy's motives and privately called for McCarthy to do more homework in their conversations. This made him a bridge between the two factions of the party, the old guard and the more moderate Republicans. In April 1951, Truman announced MacArthur had been fired for subordination. Ambrose writes Nixon was an early and major contributor to the ensuing uproar, the senator declaring that the happiest group in America were the communists and their stooges. They have been doing a hatchet job on him the past 10 years, and now the president has given them what they have always wanted, MacArthur's scalp. Nixon viewed the Europe First policy of the Truman administration as the reason for MacArthur's firing. Nixon issued a second press release that claimed Truman had tried to make it appear that the choice was between a little war in Korea or a much bigger war in Asia, which he labeled a complete distortion of the facts, when the real choice was between continuing the Korean War with no real hope of ending it or adopting a new policy which will allow our commanders in the field to end the war with a military victory. Ambrose writes the Korean War and MacArthur's firing set off the second phase of the great debate in America between two factions, one wanting to crush the communists in Asia and those wanting to contain them. Ambrose writes what made the Democrats furious was that the same Republicans who now demanded all-out war in Asia and who damned Truman for his refusal to continue to send aid to Chiang were the same men who in 1947 were in control of Congress and insisted on simultaneously lowering taxes and balancing the budget. Nixon led the Senate assault against Truman, arguing that his decision to withhold aid from Chiang had led to China going communist. Nixon notably did not join McCarthy, Bricker, William Jenner, and others in blaming General George Marshall, knowing the latter had the highest reputation of those in the Republican Party. Jenner tried to pin blame on Marshall in a series of questions to Nixon, who never once mentioned Marshall in their rapid-fire exchange. Nixon sought to unleash Chiang from Formosa and thereby create a diversion that would drain Chinese troops from Korea. He urged the use of strategic bombs to destroy targets in China, wanting the UN to have its member states send troops to Korea or pull out entirely with the US. Democrats opposed his ideas, reasoning that bombing China would lead Russia into the war and potentially start the Third World War. When Senator Bryan McMahon of Connecticut explained the Democratic position, Nixon responded by surmising that the Democrats had no alternative to MacArthur's and his own proposal. Taft agreed with Nixon, letting the latter lead the debate. Taft also gave him the strongest support with comments of, "That's right," or "I agree completely," when Nixon was making a point. Nixon introduced Senate Resolution 126, which declared that the president has not acted in the best interest of the American people in relieving MacArthur, and that the president should reconsider his action and should restore General MacArthur to the commands from which he was removed. The resolution came at a time when Truman's approval rating had plummeted to 27%, and Nixon was receiving 100 times the mail Truman did during this period. Nixon's defense of Truman's European policy differentiated him from other Senate Republicans. The Californian calling for sending more troops and planes, and this insistence on aid to Europe linked him with the Dewey wing of the party. After the 1950 Senate election, the Nixons moved into a new home in Spring Valley in northwest Washington that cost $41,000. Despite having more money, Pat still made all the curtains, draperies, and slip covers of their new home. Ambrose describes her wardrobe as skimpy, Pat recalling that her husband never paid a woman a compliment outside of remarking on their hat. Richard disliked women wearing pants and encouraged Murray Chotiner, as the latter prepared a pamphlet for Republican volunteers to ban women in slacks at Republican functions. Nixon spent more time with his staff than his family, turning to aides Bill Arnold, Jack Irwin, and Jim Gleason for administrative help instead of policy advice or ideas. Nixon first met his personal secretary, Rosemary Woods, in 1947 after he and other congressmen returned from a European trip and she handled their expense accounts. Nixon asked Rosemary to become his secretary after a Senate victory, and though she expected this would be a year or two stint, she stayed with him for a quarter century, becoming, in the opinion of Ambrose, one of the three most important women in his life. The others were Pat and Hannah. Rosemary got along well with Pat, who called her Rosie when she came to the office. Ambrose writes, after 1 year in the Senate, Nixon had made himself into one of the most important Republicans in that body. He was virtually the party's spokesman on the most important political event of the year, MacArthur's dismissal, and one of the Republican leaders in the more general attack against Truman's foreign policy. He was solidly established with the East and West Coast Republicans, with the Dewey camp, as well as the Taft wing, with the China lobby and the friends of Joe McCarthy, with the party chairman throughout the nation who could deliver the votes at national conventions, with conservative and moderate reporters, in fact, with nearly everyone who counted in the Republican Party. His youth, his drive, his enthusiasm, his speaking abilities, his partisan approach to politics, his reputation, his position as a senator from the second largest state, and his single-minded concentration on politics combined to make him a natural for more important assignments and tasks. Taking it all in all, the shy little Quaker boy from Yorba Linda who had entered politics only 5 years ago was doing sensationally well for himself. Herb Brownell saw Nixon as an almost ideal candidate for vice president and called him young, geographically right, had experience both in the House and the Senate with a good voting record, and was an excellent speaker. Eisenhower developed a team concept based on both his experiences as Supreme Commander and his personality, and wanted to have a running mate that was a young, aggressive fellow who knew the domestic issues and agreed with Eisenhower's policies. Ambrose writes of the pitfalls that laid for a potential running mate, the first being appearing overeager, which Nixon avoided by always dismissing the possibility of Eisenhower picking him as remote, the second being supporting the wrong man for the top spot, and the third was alienating the old guard as to not lose his position of bridging the two wings of the GOP. Nixon would commonly praise Taft as a wonderful and great man who just couldn't win at a time when Republicans needed to. Nixon spent the first half of 1952 blasting Democrats in speeches, lauding each Republican candidate as a tremendous improvement over what we have in the White House now. Nixon blamed Truman for losing over 100 million people to communism per year over the past 7 years and urged all-out war in Korea, asserting that any settlement was tantamount to appeasement because the price of settlement, which the communists insist upon, is a seat in the United Nations and control of Formosa, laying the foundation for eventual communist domination of all Asia, and in the end, an inevitable world war. Nixon delivered the principal speech at the New York State Republican Party's annual fundraiser at the Waldorf, Austria, on May 8, 1952. Thomas Dewey, who had invited Nixon, told him, "That was a terrific speech. Make me a promise. Don't get fat, don't lose your zeal, and you can be president someday." Dewey and Nixon went back to the former suite, where they discussed the vice presidential nomination. Nixon said he would be greatly honored, and Dewey next arranged for Nixon to meet with Herb Brownell, Lucius Clay, and Harold Talbot at the Mayflower Hotel in Washington for the young senator to get approved by the men around Eisenhower. Ambrose writes, in 1952, of the 8 20th century presidents, one was a senator when he became president, Harding, 2 were governors, Wilson and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and 3 were vice presidents, Theodore Roosevelt, Coolidge, and Truman. Under the circumstances, the idea of the freshman senator from California turning down the chance to run with an almost sure winner who was making his backers promise that he would have to serve only one term was absurd. In January 1952, after Senator Lodge announced he was putting Eisenhower's name on the ballot in New Hampshire, Eisenhower issued a statement saying he would not campaign for the Republican nomination but would accept it. Eisenhower soon came off what Ambrose calls his high horse when he trailed Taft in total number of delegates at the end of May. Nixon worked for Eisenhower behind the scenes, Nolan simultaneously running for both the Democratic and Republican nominations for the Senate, while Murray Chotiner served as his campaign manager. Due to Nolan's victory being so assured, Chotiner spent much time helping Nixon, producing a long letter that Taft could not be elected, that Nixon proceeded to make copies of and distribute to all Republicans in Congress. Although the Republicans had not won a single electoral vote from the South since 1876, the Southern Republicans acted as one-third of the delegate votes at the 1952 National Convention. Eisenhower and Taft competed for delegates from several Southern states, the most prominent being Georgia and Texas. Either Taft or Eisenhower would win if they could get a majority of the California delegation to support their candidacies, although the convention would deadlock if California split. Lodge depended on Nixon to keep the delegation together, and Nixon used his franking privilege to send 23,000 questionnaires to workers in his precinct that sought their opinion on who the strongest 1952 Republican candidate would be. Eisenhower won handedly, which upset Governor Warren, who asked Nixon not to publish the results. When they leaked, Warren felt as though he had been stabbed in the back. As a senator, Nixon had a salary of $12,500 per year with around $6,000 in speaking engagements, and the government giving him roughly $70,000 per year to run his office. The money was not enough to pay for his plane rides, manage his large volume of mail, produce his weekly radio reports, and his other expenses. Since entering politics, Nixon's friends had kept a small fund to help him, with it becoming more formal later on. Although much would be made on the correlation of contributors to Nixon's voting record, lawyer Dana Smith asserted, "I do not know of any instance in which Senator Nixon ever did anything for any contributor which he would not have done for any responsible constituent." Ambrose writes, "Smith's statement could neither be proved nor disproved. It is true that the files of Senator Nixon's office were filled with requests to federal agencies for various problems of various constituents, many of them not noticeably heavy contributors. It is also true that Nixon's office requested information about or urged speed in the resolution of problems specific to contributors to the fund. In one case, the office interceded on behalf of Dana Smith himself in a Justice Department case in which a firm owned by Smith's family was asking for a $500,000 rebate." Such inquiries were commonly made by politicians in behalf of their constituents and contributors. Nixon was neither making nor breaking rules. What was unique about Nixon was that he was the only politician in the country who engaged in such practices, while simultaneously demanding the resignation of both the DNC and the RNC chairman for having made similar phone calls to federal agencies in behalf of their friends. On July 4th, Nixon boarded a special train bringing the California delegation to Chicago, having instructed Roy Day to tell those aboard that Taft was both a wonderful person and not electable. Nixon told delegates that Eisenhower's momentum was unstoppable and advised California to get behind the latter while it could still extract a prize for its support. Nixon confessed that Earl Warren did not have a chance, and that if the state held on to its favorite son for too long, the state would get nothing, whereas if it gave Eisenhower its support, it would be rewarded with a vice presidential nomination for Nixon. Some of Warren's supporters, angered by Nixon's breach of Nolan's pledge that the California delegates were not supposed to consider alternatives to Warren, tried to get Nixon thrown off the train. The first ballot of the presidential nomination took place on July 11th, but the true climax of the convention took place on July 7th as the California delegation caucus. Warren sought to split the California vote, which would give Taft enough votes to prevail on the convention floor and block a first ballot victory for Eisenhower. Nixon rushed to the microphone and declared that California splitting its vote would be seen as splitting the differences on a matter of ethics. Nixon warned that the Taft delegation being approved would mean the Republicans were announcing to the country that we believe that ruthless machine politics is wrong only when the Democrats use it. Ambrose writes that Nixon had two further hurdles to cross: securing Eisenhower's nomination without any first ballot California votes, and Pat. When Nixon met with Pat, she sat by him as Chotiner explained that the young senator had a promising career ahead of him regardless if the Republican ticket was successful that year. At some point, Pat relented that she could make it through another campaign. Eisenhower and his staff gathered inside the Conrad Hilton Hotel to discuss his running mate. Dewey remembered that after considering Taft and Senator Everett Dirksen, he got around to mentioning Nixon as the logical nominee. Leader of the Citizens for Eisenhower organization, Paul Hoffman, supported Nixon. viewing him as one of the Republicans who had an enlightened view on foreign affairs. Nixon received a call from Eisenhower, who requested he come to his suite. Eisenhower told Nixon that he wanted to run a campaign that was a crusade for all he believed in, Nixon agreeing to join this effort. Eisenhower furthered, "I don't want a vice president who will be a figurehead. I want a man who will be a member of the team, and I want him to be able to step into the presidency smoothly in case anything happens to me." Following the meeting, Nixon and Chotiner drove to the convention hall, with Nixon considering who would nominate him and what he would say in his acceptance speech later that evening. Pat was having lunch with Helene Drown and was chewing into a sandwich when she saw a news bulletin appear that her husband had been selected as the Republican vice presidential nominee. Nixon asked Nolan to place his name in nomination, and after Nolan agreed, he went to Senator Bricker to ask if he would second his nomination. Bricker refused, tearfully saying, "After what they have said and done to Bob Taft over the last few months, I just cannot bring myself to do it. I would appreciate if you would ask somebody else." It was then that Nixon realized how important and difficult his role as a bridge between the party factions was going to be. In his acceptance speech, Eisenhower called for Republicans to join him in a crusade, and Nixon stepped to the podium. He began with a question that he knew would arouse the audience. "Haven't we got a wonderful candidate for President of the United States?" He then pledged to wage a fighting campaign for the election of a fighting candidate and to work for Republicans to win the House and Senate. Nixon then praised Taft as one of the greatest legislative leaders in the history of America and promised that Taft would be chairman of the Majority Policy Committee the following January. On July 27, Nixon stopped in Denver to meet with Eisenhower, the latter having established his headquarters at the Brown Palace Hotel there. The Democrats nominated Governor Adlai Stevenson and Senator John Sparkman. On August 20th, Paul Hoffman sent Nixon a report suggesting that civil liberties and the rights of minorities become major themes of his speeches. Nixon, believing that he could never forge an identity of his own following Eisenhower's advisors, had Chotiner respond to Hoffman by saying Nixon would study the material you furnished him. The Eisenhower campaign struggled on what to do about McCarthy, with Eisenhower believing that he could not afford to disown McCarthy, while both he and his advisors thought Nixon was too close to him. Nixon complied by saying McCarthyism was Truman's creation, and that while innocent people may be falsely accused, this should not be a deterrent from investigating. Nixon reversed his previous MacArthur-endorsed position of all-out war with China to reflect Eisenhower's view by publicly stating the time for such action had passed. Nixon's positions also included supporting the Marshall Plan and NATO, opposing higher taxes, and wanting a balanced budget. The vice presidential nominee had an interview with Kansas City Star, which he began by citing the 900 million people lost to communism since Truman ascended to the presidency, and hinted at there being sinister motives behind Truman not going after Hiss and other traitors. Nixon accused the New Deal wing of the Democratic Party of wanting to socialize America. Ambrose writes, "But behind all these and other exaggerations, there rests the basic truth. Nixon was not interested in money, not even in what it could buy. He had not entered politics to get rich. His self-portrait says he entered politics to slay dragons, beginning with the CIO, continuing through Hiss and Douglas, on to Atchison and Truman, and now Stevenson. He was the knight on the crusade. And as befits St. George, he was the embodiment of purity. He could have maintained his law practice, he said, and as a senator made handsome fees, but he had spurned the temptation. He insisted on the highest possible ethical standards. Regardless of the merits of Mr. Gabrielson's position," Nixon had pontificated of the RNC chairman, "his effectiveness has been irreparably damaged because the charges against him will constantly be used to camouflage and confuse the issue and to protect those who are really guilty of corruption." On September 18th, the New York Post carried a banner headline, "Secret Nixon Fund." Leo Katcher wrote the story, which ignored Peter Edson reporting an explanation that in no way hinted at Nixon keeping the money for himself. The latter's story would be buried in the editorial pages, while the allegation in the Post headline would draw national attention. Chotiner and Rogers claim the story was no big deal, and Ambrose notes that this would have been correct if it were any other candidate, but claims Nixon had set himself up as the definition of propriety and had made himself peculiarly vulnerable. Furthermore, Nixon had made the Democrats so mad that they lost their perspective and, all too eager, seized on the fund to attack him. Nixon would soon realize he was in trouble as Rose Woods noted a surge in phone calls and telegrams. DNC Chairman Stephen A. Mitchell made a demand for Nixon to resign from the ticket. After Mitchell's demand, Nixon told reporters that it was an attempt to pull a political smear and questioned why Sparkman was not asked to resign when his wife was on a government payroll. Nixon noted that he had been investigating the communists in the United States and said that communists and left-wingers had been fighting him with every smear they could imagine. He added that the $16,000 was being used on his part to avoid using taxpayers' money to pay expenses, and said the purpose of the smears was to make him relent in his attacks on the communists and the crooks in the present administration. The speech was impromptu and delivered with great emotion, receiving a strong, positive response from his audiences. Chotiner told Nixon that all they had to do is to get you before enough people talking about this fun, and we will win this election in a landslide. Karl Mundt called the scandal a filthy left-wing smear, and Arthur Summerfield supported Nixon staying on the ticket when he observed that the party would split over a possible replacement. The response was not all positive, however, as the DNC issued a notice to editors and reporters that cited criminal law on bribery and graft by congressional members, and Truman directed his attorney general to investigate the possibility of prosecuting Nixon and his contributors. In a September 20th editorial of the Herald Tribune, Bill Robinson, one of Eisenhower's closest friends, concluded the proper course of Senator Nixon in the circumstances to make a formal offer of withdrawal from the ticket. How this offer is acted on will be determined by an appraisal of all the facts in the light of General Eisenhower's unsurpassed fairness of mind. The editorial almost crushed Nixon, who was convinced that Eisenhower had either inspired or approved of it. Stassen sent Nixon a rambling 2-page telegram that called in his resignation from the ticket for the good of the GOP. Although Nixon had yet to hear anything from Eisenhower directly, the latter had drafted a letter that suggested Nixon invite Democratic chairman of the Senate Committee on Ethics in Government, Paul Douglas, to examine your complete records and to make his findings public. Eisenhower scrapped the letter and instead publicly stated his belief that Nixon was an honest man who would put the facts before the American people fairly and squarely. Dewey instructed Nixon that he could circumvent the Dump Nixon movement by going on national television to explain the fund and having the public wire their verdict to him. On September 21st, Eisenhower called Nixon, who said he had not made a decision yet, and stated his belief that Nixon ought to go on a nationwide television program and tell them everything there is to tell, everything you can remember since the days you entered public life, tell them about any money you have ever received. Ambrose writes, "The myth is that Eisenhower was naive about politics. The truth was that he was a master at the game, which he played with as cold a calculator as Harry Truman or Franklin Roosevelt. In the war, if one of his subordinates had told him to shit or vacate, he would have sent the general home on a slow boat. But he knew that in politics he did not have that kind of power. In the war, every American officer in Europe had been directly under his command and depended upon him for his continuation in office. In the campaign in 1952, no Republican office holder owed his position to Eisenhower with the single exception of Nixon, who was the vice presidential candidate because of Eisenhower. Even at that, Nixon would still be a U.S. senator if the Republicans lost or he left the ticket." Ambrose writes that Nixon's greatest strength going into the broadcast was to charge his weakness. Dana Smith proved the money was all used for legitimate campaign expenses, and the firm of Gibson, Dunn, and Crutcher had concluded the fund was legal. On the morning of September 23rd, Nixon took a swim and had a long walk with Rogers. Later, Dewey called Nixon and told him that Eisenhower's advisors had suggested that he resign at the end of the broadcast that night. Nixon told Dewey that he had already prepared his remarks and could not change them. When Dewey advised that he just add a sentence at the end with his resignation from the ticket, Nixon did not respond, eventually shouted of Eisenhower's advisors, "Just tell them that I haven't the slightest idea what I am going to do, and if they want to find out, they better listen to the broadcast, and tell them I know something about politics too." He slammed the receiver down and sat alone before Chotiner came, the latter telling him of his intentions to hold a large press conference on Nixon's detractors in the Republican Party if he resigned. The Nixons rode over to the El Capitan Theater studio, arriving 15 minutes before airtime. Nixon told Pat that he did not think he could go through with the broadcast, and the latter told him that she believed he could and held his hand as she led him onto the stage.
Ladies and gentlemen, Senator Richard Nixon.
My fellow Americans, I come before you tonight as a candidate for the vice presidency and as a man whose honesty and integrity has been questioned. because if I don't, they'll
Nixon
probably
admitted
be
to
saying
receiving
this
a gift
about
from a
me, too.
Texas supporter.
We did get something, a gift, after the election. A man down in Texas heard Pat on the radio mention the fact that our two youngsters would like to have a dog. And believe it or not, the day before we left on this campaign trip, we got a message from the Union Station in Baltimore saying they had a package for us. We went down to get it. You know what it was? It was a little Cocker Spaniel dog in a crate that he'd sent all the way from Texas. Black and white, spotted. And our little girl, Tricia, the 6-year-old, named it Checkers. And you know, the kids, like all kids, love the dog. And I just want to say this right now, that regardless of what they say about it, we're going to keep him.
Nixon then stood to walk in front of a desk and launched his concluding remarks.
And now, finally, I know that you wonder whether or not I am going to stay on the Republican ticket or resign. Let me say this. I don't believe that I ought to quit, because I'm not a quitter. And incidentally, Pat's not a quitter. After all, her name was Patricia Ryan, and she was born on St. Patrick's Day, and you know the Irish never quit. But the decision, my friends, is not mine. I would do nothing that would harm the possibilities of Dwight Eisenhower to become President of the United States. And for that reason, I am submitting to the Republican National Committee tonight through this television broadcast the decision which it is theirs to make. Let them decide whether my position on the ticket will help or hurt. And I'm going to ask you to help them decide. Wire and write the Republican National Committee whether you think I should stay on or whether I should get off. And whatever their decision is, I will abide by it.
As Nixon finished his remarks and was congratulated by Pat, Chotiner, Hillings, and Rogers, he was informed by the producer that the telephone switch is lit up like a Christmas tree. Tens of thousands of telegrams jam the wires, with the RNC in Washington receiving 300,000 letters and telegrams signed by over 1 million people, and there was an additional thousands of wires reported by the Republican committees at the state level, running 350 to 1 in favor of Nixon. Eisenhower, speaking to a Cleveland audience, said he was going to ask Nixon to come see him the following day for a talk, and sent a telegram to his running mates. Nixon, defying the general, wired Eisenhower to tell him he was resuming his campaign tour for the next 5 days and would be fine with meeting him any time after. Nixon changed his mind and decided to fly to Wheeling. The jubilant Nixon received telegrams from Stassen and Dewey, both praising the speech. When the plane stopped at the Wheeling airport, Eisenhower rushed up the steps of the plane and met the Nixons. Richard mumbled, "General, you didn't need to come out to the airport." Eisenhower grinned, "Why not? You're my boy." In his public comments, Eisenhower praised Nixon as having vindicated himself and acted as a man of courage and honor, and so far as I'm concerned, stands higher than ever before. After Nixon delivered his own remarks, he noticed Nolan in the crowd. The latter told him that he had given a great speech, and Nixon cried as the curtains came down. Nixon learned it isn't what the facts are, but what they appear to be that counts when you are under fire in a political campaign. He would celebrate the anniversary of the speech each year thereafter, with Pat never liking to think about it or talk about it. 5 days before the election, Drew Pearson wrote of getting copies of Nixon's tax returns. He charged Nixon with having sworn a joint property value of less than $10,000 to qualify for a tax exemption on California taxes. The outraged Nixon discovered that another California couple with the same names as him and his wife had filed for the exemption. Nixon would regret the things he said during the 1952 campaign, apologizing for the intensity of those attacks in his memoir. Nixon referred to Adlai Stevenson as more veneer than substance. Beneath his glibness and mocking wit, he was shallow, flippant, and indecisive. Stevenson was able to sting Nixon in a way no other Democrat could. Nixon called Stevenson a weakling, waster, and a small-caliber Truman, with a career that he owed to an organization infested with mobsters, gangsters, and remnants of the old Capone gang. Toward the campaign's conclusion, Nixon's rhetoric became more wild and reckless, at one point calling the trio of Truman, Stevenson, and Atchison traitors to the high principles in which many of the nation's Democrats believe. The 1952 election is one of the most bitter of the 20th century and featured the most mudslinging. Joe McCarthy pretended to mistake Alger and Adlai. President Truman emerged as the only Democrat willing to criticize Eisenhower, calling him a captive general controlled by Republican big businessmen, and Eisenhower himself, who was forced to stand next to Senator Jenner, the man who called George Marshall a traitor, Stevenson was the one participant who could look at his performance with pride, offering a domestic program that would extend the social gains of the New Deal. Stevenson could not cut into Eisenhower's popularity, however, who took a firm stand in the middle of the road as he promised a balanced budget, favored amending Taft-Hartley, encouraged collective bargaining and the right to strike, and pledged himself to collective security abroad with the cooperation of NATO and the UN. The 1952 election's central issue was the unpopular Korean War, with Eisenhower taking a moderate position that he would neither escalate or abandon the South Koreans. On election day, Eisenhower had 34 million votes to Stevenson's 27 million. The Republicans took control of the House and the Senate. Ambrose writes, in Eisenhower's view, there were pluses and minuses about Nixon's performance in the campaign. The pluses were his service as a bridge to the old guard, his eagerness to blast the Democrats, and his image as St. George. The minuses were that Nixon was too right-wing and irresponsible in his views, immature was the word Eisenhower most often used, that Nixon was too strident in attacking the Democrats, and that he made himself too squeaky clean in his checkers speech. In short, Eisenhower was ambivalent about Nixon, liking him for some of the same things he disliked about him. Nixon was equally ambivalent about Eisenhower. He was awed by General Eisenhower, as everyone else was, but more than a bit suspicious about Eisenhower the politician. He also had major foreign policy differences with the president-elect, such as what to do in Korea and China, where Eisenhower's program was much closer to that followed by Truman and Atchison than it was to the one advocated by MacArthur and Nixon. For 6 years, Nixon had habitually criticized presidential announcements. Now he would have to learn to bite his tongue and support policies he did not believe in. As had been the case since the nominating convention in July, the relationship between Eisenhower and Nixon was dominated by a fact neither of the two men ever mentioned. Nixon needed Eisenhower, but Eisenhower did not need Nixon. Whether said aloud or not, Nixon knew it to be the case and prepared to calculate his actions on the basis of that fact.